Welcome back to another MobileSentrix tips and tricks. My name is Derek and today I'm going to be showing you a repair. Today's video is going to cover specifically how to replace the HDMI on a console. And the board I'm going to be working on today is a PS5. Now this video is designed specifically for those of you that have not done one before. I'm going to be doing a deep dive into all of the tips and tricks that I have that'll make it so the first time you try it, you have the best shot at being successful. There are some things that I'll be doing in this video that might be a little bit over the top, especially if you're a tech that does this repair often. Some of these steps you might think are a little bit much. But the more that I can pack into the concepts, the easier this will be. And maybe for those of you that do HDMIs, some of the stuff that I show might help you have an easier go at replacing HDMIs. Let's get into the video. So as you can see, this HDMI port got bent quite a bit. You can see it kind of bent here and it's put some strain on the through holes here on the left side. I don't think it's pulled any of the pads off the logic board, and I'll explain how I'm going to make sure that I don't pull any pads here in a little bit. But as you can see, this HDMI definitely took a hard hit and it needs to be replaced. So the first thing that I want to do in order to make the process a little bit easier is add a lower melting solder to the joints. Now this isn't necessary, but it definitely helps in the removal of the HDMI in order to prevent pulling pads, and it'll have an easier time for the legs to exit the actual through holes if the solder is at a lower melting point. And the reason for that is because of the thermal mass behind the game consoles. The logic board likes to absorb the heat and suck it away, and in order for the HDMI to come off, the solder has to continually be liquid as the legs come out. So lowering the overall temperature that the solder needs to get to is going to help tremendously with this process. So I'm going to add some 138 Celsius solder paste to the legs on the bottom. This will mix with the factory solder and help bring the overall temperature that the board needs to get to down so that the legs will let go. And I'm also going to add some solder paste to the pins. Now typically this isn't necessary, but I like to ensure no pads getting pulled if things go wrong, especially on an HDMI like this one where it's taken such a hard hit at an angle. Once I'm satisfied with the amount of solder that I've put on the legs and the pins, I'm going to start warming up the board from both the bottom and the top with my heat gun. Now you'll notice that I have my rework station without a refining nozzle because I want the surface area that the heat covers to be as big as possible, because this HDMI is much larger than most components. So I'll heat from the top and I'll heat from the bottom, warming up the overall general area. And then I'm going to focus a lot of temperature on the bottom, and I'm going to continue to hold the temperature there. And I like to basically max out my machine as far as how hot I can go and the airflow itself. This will take a little bit of time, but you will start to see some movement. Here you can see with my tweezers, I'm barely putting any pressure, not prying at all. The last thing I want to do is pry this board out. And as I continually kind of check it, I'll find a moment where I can feel it start to slip. And I'm just going to walk it up and out of those holes nice and slowly without putting a lot of strain on it, so that I don't pull any pads or damage the through holes as it comes out. And there you go. You can see that it's come off nice and clean. And while the board is still warm, I'm going to go back in with a little bit of flux, wick, my soldering iron, and a heat gun. And we're going to go over and pull up all of the solder through those through holes, clean them out perfectly. So from below I've got my heat as well, and above I've got the soldering iron pushing around the wick so that it sucks up all of the solder and leaves me with nice through holes. I'm also going to go over all of the pads with the soldering iron to make sure that there's no 138 solder paste left on there along with the factory solder. We're basically removing all traces of solder, both factory and what I've applied, so that we have nice clean joints for soldering our new solder to. I'll clean up all of the burnt flux with some isopropyl alcohol, microfiber cloth, or clean room wipe and a brush on both the top and the bottom so that we get a nice clean surface to start working with. You can see where the port had kind of got pushed into the frame from whatever hit it took that bent it so bad at the beginning. But having the through holes nice and clean like that is going to make for a much easier time installing the new HDMI. Now we can get our new HDMI and we can check the alignment just to make sure that it fits and that the pins are lined up with the pads. I'll flip the board over, and I prefer to do it this way, where I put a bit of tension on the connector so that it's pushed against a logic board from below. And I do that with my finger because the heat won't transfer enough to burn myself. But I'm gonna add some 183 solder paste. So we're gonna go with a higher melting solder for this. This solder is designed specifically for components that are going to see some action, some movement. So it's going to be a lot stronger than your 138, and it's more desirable. So I'm going to add some to the legs as they pop through those through holes, and we're going to take our iron and go over that and just really tack them in place for now to secure it so that it doesn't want to move as I go on to the next step, where I solder on the individual pins to the logic board. And I like to do this next part under a microscope where I can add solder paste and carefully go in and tack individually the individual pins. And at this point, I don't mind if there is any bridging between pins. It actually works in your favor, because if you know how to work a bridging and move the bridging along, you're actually able to deposit almost an excess of solder, or just the right amount really, of solder on the pads and the pin to have a really solid joint between the two. I'll move the bridging along, adding flux along the way to help and assist in the move the solder around until I'm satisfied where all of the pins have soldered to the pads with a nice ramp of solder going up, as you can see here. I'll double check for bridging, and once I've done that, we're good to move on to kind of the last thing that I like to do before our final cleanup and reassembly, is to add sufficient solder through the through holes that it goes through and through all the way to the other side of the board, giving us a really strong and sturdy HDMI. Because I swear that at least on the PS5s, these HDMIs, the joints from the factory, just aren't as strong as they should be. So I want to give this its best shot at having longevity. So I'm going to add some 183 solder paste, and I'm going to come in with my heat gun, and I'm going to slowly work that until the solder and the board heats up enough that the solder will suck down into the hole that will go all the way through to the other side, and it'll start to ramp up and creep up the other side of the leg on the other side of the board. And I'll do this on both sides and continue to add solder paste until I'm content with the amount of solder that has gone through each one of the holes, leaving a factory-like look on each one of the legs. And as you can see here, when I flip it over, we've got a nice ramp of solder coming through the other side. This tells me that I've got a really nice solid joint. The last thing that I want to do is go and clean up any of the excess flux, any solder that got left here and there. Just clean it up, make it look a little bit better. Now, given that the flux is rolled around, it's definitely going to leave streaks and marks around, but those are more cosmetic than anything. If you really wanted to, you could put some Captain tape down and kind of prevent the board from discoloring as much with the flux. But obviously that's cosmetic and it's not functional, so there's not going to be any issue there. So after giving a good clean, we'll just double check our work one more time under a microscope, making sure that we have nice clean solder joints with no bridging between them. And once we're content with that, we can reassemble it. And you'll notice throughout this process, I avoided all of the small components that are next to the HDMI, both on the back and the front, with both the soldering iron, tweezers, heat gun, whatever it was. I didn't have to move them, replace them. So if you're careful, you won't knock them off, and you won't have to worry about soldering them back on. And there you go. Those are my tips and tricks. Obviously, this is for the beginner, so that you could have as much knowledge as I could possibly convey from my experience and how to have a successful repair if this is your first time doing it. As you get more and more experienced, you may find yourself not adding the 138, and you might find yourself using other methods. Find what works best for you. If you yourself have your own tips and tricks that you'd like others to know about, comment them down below. Hopefully you found this content entertaining and educational. Let me know if there's something you'd like to see in a future video. Thanks a ton for watching. We'll see you in the next video.